All right. I think I'm gonna kick us off here. It's so good to be here with you all today, albeit virtually. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar series. Today, we'll be talking about month one, year one of the Trump administration's attacks on some of the key issues in communities that we all care deeply about, including DEI, immigration, and LGBTQ populations. So today we'll be joined by three excellent panelists, and I'll introduce them in a bit. But before we get started, I'm just gonna go over a few housekeeping topics. So I know some of you have already been doing this. Thank you so much. But if you can, please open up the chat and introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, your name, your organization, or affiliation. And along the way, I'm sure many questions will be coming up. So if you'd like to ask a question for our panelists at the end of the session, we'll have a Q&A moment. And so if you could open the Q&A box and type in your question, and please let us know if there's a specific panelist that you'd like us to direct your question at. And I'll be prompting you along the way, and we'll be collecting all of your questions. So feel free to just pop them in real time. You don't have to wait for the end to send them in, and we'll answer them at the end. Um, so with that, I think we'll get started. I know many of us are feeling a lot of feelings right now, shocked, dismayed, maybe feeling a little hopeless. I know I can go through waves of that. Maybe some of us are feeling really motivated right now to take action and really be in community with folks who are striving towards equality. And so I know many of us are here today to hear what we can do and what we can learn from these amazing panelists today. So yeah, just want to recognize the gravity of the situation that we're in politically and culturally in the US. I know many folks here probably aren't in the US, but are feeling the ripple effects around the world of a lot of these conversations and a lot of the issues that we're seeing today politically. So really grateful that all of you came out today and to think and move this conversation forward in terms of how we can really make some change, because I know we're all feeling a little bit under the water now. So just so you all are aware, my name is Caroline. I work on strategic initiatives at Equimundo. Equimundo is an organization that focuses on engaging men and boys in efforts for gender equality and social justice by transforming intergenerational patterns of harm and promoting patterns of care, empathy, and accountability for men and boys throughout their lives. Um, Today, I'm joined by three stellar guests who we'll hear from to talk about some of the major policies that are being dismantled and communities being attacked after a month of Trump being in office. So we'll hear from David Smith, PhD, who is the co-author of the book Good Guys: How Men Can Be Better Allies for Women in the Workplace. He's an associate professor and co-director of the Gender and Work Initiative at the Johns Hopkins Carey School of Business. So thank you, David, for being here. We also are joined by Rodrigo Stein, who is an immigrant and a father, and he's also the director of Health Equity and Strategic Community Partnerships at La Clínica del Pueblo. He leads efforts to reduce healthcare language barriers and advocate for policies and partnerships that address the needs of low-income Latino immigrants in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Rodrigo, for being with us. And lastly, we have Sarah Kate Smeagol. SK is a non-binary storyteller, educator, and creator who has built an online safe space for anyone who is trying to start their journey to their most authentic self, or be the best ally that they can be. So through wit, humor, and introspective thought threads, SK weaves the importance of inclusion and diversity into everything they create. So thank you so much. I'm very excited to bring all of your diverse experiences together. I know these are can be seen as disparate topics, but I think there's a really strong and important through line here talking about narratives around masculinities that we can really bring as an add here to the conversation. So just to say, we'll be using that lens around gender and masculinity to see what's happening in the US, but I just want to emphasize that I know we have a lot of international colleagues here who are impacted by the results of these policies and these cultural narratives. So hoping to make that translation between, the domestic and the international here in this conversation today. So with that, let's get started with our first panelist. I'll go to David. We've seen many of the first executive orders that President Trump has signed. One of them has been to end the radical and wasteful DEI programs in the federal government. Not only in the administration, but we've seen some corporations who have significantly rolled back a lot of their DEI programs, including Google, Meta, McDonald's, et cetera. So this is not just within the U.S. government, but this really has a huge effect on our private sector and the public sector and et cetera. So we know that there are a lot of ongoing conversations around the country about what DEI is. But David, please talk to us about those conversations and how that's impacting men specifically and narratives around masculinity, and why we're seeing some of this backlash really boil to the surface more recently. Why is it a lightning rod for men specifically?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline, and special thanks to Ekimundo and Gary for hosting this conversation. These are difficult, challenging times, I think, for all of us, our families, our friends, and so many people that this is just touching right now in ways that we all need a little self-care and a little group care to be with each other. And but let me address the topic at hand here. And these really are far-reaching, and you can, on the surface, you can look at it and say these are really targeted at the federal government, but because again the federal government represents all of us, and so many of us count on many of the different programs to do the work that we do, as well as take care of the people that are involved in that. And so it really does have far-reaching impact into everything. And so many organizations have federal contracts. So even if you're a private corporation today, the fact that okay, maybe this doesn't directly impact you based on the language in the executive orders, but certainly there's concern about the fact that because you have federal contracts, you have federal funding in some way, that it's going to impact you, and you're going to be scrutinized and looked at. And as I think is probably a fair assessment, as we've seen some of that happening already. It's been interesting to see the reaction, I think. Let me just talk about it from outside the federal government for a second. That a lot we've seen in the news headlines of all these major corporations and some smaller ones too that are taking it to heart, and they're rolling back all of their DEI programs. It's just a widespread cancellation of it, and it's really disheartening. And I think there's a lot of disillusioned people out there right now and trying to figure out within those organizations, what does that mean for me? And I think that's something we all should be thinking about as well. But I think that what that shows us is the true values of those organizations in many ways, that they weren't maybe necessarily committed to it in the beginning, and maybe it was much more performative in nature, and it really wasn't part of that. Because we also see on the other side of this that there are lots of companies today that are doubling down and recommitting themselves to this work, and recommitting to who they are as an organization, their identity, that this is core to who they are and their people, their clients, their customers, again, all of those networks. So I think that's, if there's a little bit of a glimmer of hope out there that I hang on to, that's one of them that I see. And then I think there's a lot of companies in between that we're seeing who are wrestling with what to do. And in some cases, they recognize the importance of the work for their people. They recognize the importance of the work for their business, and maybe for their clients out there. And so they are trying to find ways to do this that, again, doesn't use language or acronyms like DEI that tend to be lightning rods right now so much in our society. And so we see a shifting and a changing going on around some of the language and the narrative or the framing around these different programs. And I think that, again, depending on where that goes, it'll be interesting to see the value of those kinds of programs. But I think that brings up a broader interest and topic here that I have is that, you know, many people and, many of us have talked about the where DEI programming and DEI initiatives out there, where have they been and what have they been accomplishing all along? And maybe one of the challenges that we're seeing is a lot of backlash against programming that in many ways made some people feel very excluded. We'll come back to that in just a second. And but also around programming that there was this uh, maybe foreignness of language, right? Of just feeling uncomfortable because I don't really understand the language or the concepts. And I don't know how they apply to me. And in many cases, again, people have been disillusioned by because they felt like they weren't included in this conversation. And then I think the last part of that is really thinking about, have we spent the time and the thought to really show impact? And again, organizations like Ecomundo are definitely doing that and really centered and focused on that, but that may not be the standard across a lot of these programs. And the way that they're implemented is really important in thinking about that. So as we think about moving forward, I think one of the places that we can think about from a DEI programming perspective is there a chance to rethink the way that we implement, the way that we frame these programs, the language that we're using? Is it inclusive language even that we're using to frame these programs? How are we including everybody, including people of majority identities into this and giving them a role, giving them a place to feel like they have a voice and they have their own needs and concerns. And we could certainly touch a little bit on that, but I think that that's part of where we need to go as we think about maybe a little bit of a DEI do-over moving forward here. I think the measuring and the quantifying, or not, maybe not necessarily quantifying, but showing impact and results is really important. So it's like, what's the problem we're solving, and let's show impact and results. And we all recognize some of the challenges that are inherent in this work, and that it takes time in many cases, and some of the impact is not necessarily as objective or quantifiable. But finding ways that we can do that shows people that this is the value of the program and how it affects you and the people around you every day. And I think connecting the story, the impact that it has on individual people is really important as we go forward in this. The last part I would just like to talk about this demographic of, especially of young white men that have maybe in many ways felt and talked about the backlash and feeling like they've been left behind. And we certainly could make that an assumption or connection with some of the election results as you look at the demographic differences and some of the where people voted. And maybe they were feeling a little disillusioned or left out in some way. And I think that's a call to us to rethink, how are we including everyone there? And the different forms of masculinity that have taken up the mantle around this anti-DEI backlash has really gone toward a form of masculinity that I don't think many people identify with, and really left it to well, what's the other option, and who's exemplifying that, who's role modeling that, who's the spokesperson, so to speak, of for other forms of masculinity, more healthy forms of masculinity that I think a lot of young men are looking for. The research certainly tells us that they want to be more equal partners at home. They want to be more equal parents, and be much more involved from a caregiving perspective. And I think we'll hear a little more hopefully from Rodrigo on that later today in this conversation, because the care work, men being involved in that care work, is really important in creating equity in our organizations, our families, and our society. And so I do think we need to think about what is the message that we're sending to these young men, and where are we giving them that hope of being involved and showing them that they can be involved. Because right now, I think the only message they're getting is the opposite of that. And I think that's part of the challenge that we have. But we could talk about this all day, but let me stop there, because I know I want to hear more from some of our other panelists. But thanks, Caroline.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks for framing that. And I think, to your point about how we get the narrative and the frame of DEI right, so that we can actually reach the populations of the people we're trying to bring into the tent, basically, is such an important point, and something at Equimundo we've been thinking a lot about in terms of looking at our research of how many men who are experiencing economic precarity or a feeling that they have a disillusionment with their economic futures are actually much more susceptible to anti-feminist or anti-equity or anti-rights framing or stories. And so that's something that we've been thinking a lot about. And it's not just economic precarity, but it's also um, Black and brown men who have been experiencing a lot of marginalization because of their race, feeling like there's no hope or the system is rigged against them, and how that sort of narrative really has been sort of exploited or weaponized, I think, by right movements. And so something definitely to keep in mind throughout the course of this conversation about the stories that are told, the narratives that are told around certain populations or demographics, and how policies can kind of reflect that. So thanks for your reflections there. And just moving to our next panelist, Rodrigo, I know David mentioned sort of the idea around caring workplaces or caring infrastructure. What does that look like in your work? And how is what we're seeing with the Trump administration policies reflecting the cultural narrative around immigrant labor and the value of certain work? How have you seen that show up, not just in the past month, but in your work at La Clínica de Pueblo?
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today. Thank you, Equimundo, for putting such a wonderful panel in interesting times, as we all are going through it. So yeah, I'll just start introducing a bit about the organization I'm here representing today. I work for La Clínica del Pueblo. We're a federally qualified health center operating in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. We provide primary care, mental health services, primarily to uninsured and underinsured, low-income, limited English proficient, largely Latino and immigrant population. Going back to the notions of care that you mentioned and how they are connected with everything that's going on. I do think it's very interesting that we are noticing and living in a time where there's growing anxiety about immigration. However, the overwhelming data and aside from the positive contributions that immigrants across the board produce, is the majority of the work being performed by immigrants is in the care professions. It's everything from childcare, from the essential work that was elevated at its peak to at COVID, from stocking our grocery stores, from all the janitorial work and cleaning that has to be done, and even the agricultural, the notion of the nurturing and producing the food that sustains us. That is the work that most of immigrants do in this country are conducting. Yet that is producing that level of anxiety. And I think that anxiety is coming across and in gendered forms as this notion of hypermasculinity, etc., from the precarization of society in general, right? Like the precarization of jobs is leading a lot of people in very economic distressing situations where they essentially they go down the ladder and the weaker get sort of this brunt of the rejection. But I do think it's in this care work that you could offer an alternative narrative, right? Like maybe it's these types of jobs that sustain, that nurture us, that like really are the cornerstone of society. I was reading a report that right now in the LA fires, the people who did all the cleanup in Altadena and all these places was immigrant labor, right? It's the people who are sustaining. I, as a parent right now, who had have to send my child care to have to send my child to daycare, it's being performed by immigrant labor. So I think the more we value that profession, the more we value that care and nurturing profession, the more we elevate it, the more we speak of those professions as cornerstones to the daily function of society over, for example, this speculative, which is also gendered in a very masculine way, like the speculation over crypto, over all these things that try to essentially take an easy way out. You're essentially bypassing the hard work of raising kids, being in community, uncomfortable at a point, but we're trying to avoid that over the speculative, extractive narrative that is actually harmful and destructive, and eventually we'll eat ourselves up. I do think, going back to sort of like the notions and tying sort of what David was presenting earlier, I think one of the issues as well with DEI, and speaking to myself and working in public health and healthcare, I think the issues and why maybe some people have not really, why sort of like these narratives have not really produced the change that we want, and we're receiving a backlash, is because we talked about representation, but without actual substantive redistribution, right? And I think we have to start talking about that economic redistribution, the inclusion from an economic standpoint. And that's where I think like the concept, we have to talk about immigration without avoiding the issue of labor, right? Like, but there has to be substantial redistribution beyond just representation for us to really make substantial changes. So I don't know if I went on so many tangents, but yeah, I do think the narrative around caregiving professions, inviting more men into this type of work, which is not easy, which is hard work, but it is the work that sustains society. And we have to elevate and bring more positive narratives behind that over this speculative, extractive thing that eventually it'll destroy us all, right? Like it'll eat us all up, and we have to challenge that.
Yeah, thanks, Rodrigo. Definitely something at Equimundo we're really focused on is thinking a lot about the gendered narrative around what type of labor is valued. Thinking about, I like how you said the function of the vast majority of immigrant labor is undervalued and is sometimes perceived as a threat, even though that labor is largely feminized by like dominant narratives in society, including cleaning, cooking, childcare, cleaning workplaces, etc. And so there's the narrative that it's threatening, but at the same time it's feminized, and so it's just it's a large contradiction. I think we're seeing that the right has been really effective at again weaponizing for their own political interests. So yeah, just really helpful framing here, thinking about the topic of masculinity and how it connects to what the Trump administration has been able to dismantle thus far.
Can I just add one thing as well?
Please.
Like, and about that, and working in healthcare and providing health services, we see the impact on the body, right? Like how these jobs eventually worn you out. So this is and here's like the double-edged sword. This is a labor that is sustaining the daily conditions, while at the same time these bodies are being debilitated. I was thinking in Spanish, debilitando, but like debilitating, wearing down, like yes, without any essential workplace protection, without any guaranteed access to healthcare. So it's this cycle at the same time that benefits on this labor, exploits it, and leaves it to be undervalued, and then is considered a threat. So I think we have to reaffirm the value of caregiving work, reaffirm the value of expanding healthcare, not because you're an immigrant, just because you're a human. You should be guaranteed the healthcare that you need. And I think those are the values that are the universal things that we have to ground. And maybe that's trying to link up the conversation with what David was presenting. Maybe those are the values that DEI and initiatives should start really pushing forward: the universality of our material conditions and our material needs as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just thinking about how we call men into these conversations, knowing that everybody needs care, they need care, and men get a lot of enjoyment and value from caring for others. So reframing our narrative around the idea of care as a woman's role and actually having it be a universal benefit to all of us. And so, yeah, thanks for your comments there. Just moving to Sarah Kate, as a millennial who is obsessively online, thinking a lot about narratives around masculinities and the so-called manosphere, and kind of what the right has been able to do in terms of tapping into online communities and digital spaces where young men are, and really using ideas around masculinity to shape their base and their policies. I really am inspired by you describing yourself as a storyteller, because I think a lot of what we've been talking about revolves around how dominant cultural narratives are really driven by certain stories that are told and which stories are allowed to be told. So I'd love to hear your perspective as, a content creator and as a person who makes digital communities thrive. What are you seeing in the cultural conversation around gender, and why is storytelling such an important part of what you do in your work, and what you're seeing in this current moment politically in the US?
Sure. So first of all, thank you. Like our other two panelists said, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm offering today a non-binary perspective. I'm a non-binary person living in a nation that now only recognizes two genders or two sexes. I'm both intersex and non-binary, so I quite literally live between the lines of what our country is defining as what lives here. So my community and what I've built is a vast just variety and diversity of people and experiences through gender and sex. I started sharing online, to give you a little bit of background info of how I got into this work. I started sharing about my journey to and through my gender affirming top surgery. And through sharing that, which was content I just was not seeing or gathering online at the time, 5 years ago, I kind of accumulated a bunch of people who were looking for those conversations and looking for a place to safely explore their own gender affirming care and how to access, acquire, and seek support through those journeys. So that's how my online platform grew. And through growing that and kind of embracing that, instead of privately sharing this with family and friends, it was becoming more of a public, I had a public eye on me. I decided to embrace that and allow these conversations to be facilitated on my page, and see where it would go. So coming into this about 5 years deep into building a community of just true diversity through gender, people living in fluidity, people kind of just not following binary expectations, generally speaking, and now entering this kind of phase of policy and enactment is a very interesting crossover for me. As you were saying, stories of especially people living between binaries are quite literally being erased or silenced. I feel lucky every day that I wake up and I still have Meta accounts that are active and I'm able to share on, because they are being deleted, erased, suppressed, like through the algorithm and through the lack of protection that has been enforced by Meta recently. So I'm just getting to a point where I'm able to safely navigate how to continue these conversations and collect information kind of on the ground, mouth to mouth, or I guess hand to hand digitally, of people and how this is impacting their day-to-day lives. I think I hear a lot recently from people outside of the queer community or outside of the non-binary community saying that the words of the president or the words of our leaders won't have real impact or won't affect real lives. And that's simply not what's happening. The media isn't necessarily sharing real stories of what's happening to my community. You're not seeing it unless you know someone who's non-binary and they're talking about it and feel safe to do so. But what I'm seeing is real life impact in our documentation, in our ability to travel, in our ability to find safe work and safe housing. It's like a very strong ripple effect from the moment that this administration took office, that gender in general is very much under a close eye and a very strict, not just observation, but trying to keep things a certain way so that it works for the administration. The binary is being strictly pushed upon everyone, men, women, non-binary folks, folks who live anywhere between those lines, because it benefits the administration to do so. So voices like mine are definitely not as loud as they should be at this time, not just by choice for the people who are trying to speak up, but systematically what has been occurring for the queer community. But the online community is speaking, they are sharing, they are organizing, and they are there if you look for them. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at, what I'm seeing. I think that my number one thing that I can say or leave with anyone who's interested in learning more or knowing more about the real impacts of trans and queer people right now in America and worldwide, as we know it's rippling, is to search them out and follow them. As I said, the media isn't necessarily sharing what is needed to be known about the ripple effect of the executive orders and the legislation being pushed. So to find real people sharing about how it is affecting them is the best way right now to gather that information and source it for yourself.
Thanks, Sarah Kate. Yeah, I have been really recently in the past year or so thinking a lot about not only algorithm design, but also just like the design of the social media and internet architecture such that, you know, you can, it's a political project where you can
Sure.
score 1 point away from someone on your behavioral map and then be actively not put in the same like ecosystem as other people who might be able to form a political coalition with you, but because of like your profile in the you know social media ecosystem, you're not like put in front of each other in the same in the same media diet. And so it's such a good point, Sarah Kate, about like actively bridging across lines that don't often speak to each other and then actively following each other in terms of the stories they're telling and spreading that to other people. We have to do the work together in community because the social media algorithms and spaces won't do it for us. So really appreciate those remarks. We have a little bit more time just to ask a few more questions to our panelists, but in the meantime, I'm seeing some questions pop up in the chat. This is amazing. If you could just pop them in, because after this round, we'll go to our audience members. So yeah, with that, just want to circle back to David. I know, you know, you mentioned some of the action steps or steps forward look like, you know, doing another review of the evaluation systems of some of these DEI programs and thinking about how we're reframing our impact to wider audiences. So I'd love to hear, you know, what that do-over might look like and like what's your vision for what that might look like. Who else do we need to be bringing into these conversations to the point about like bridging across these kind of these lines that divide and how we do that. We can do that really practically moving forward from this webinar.
Yeah, one of the places the work's been going on, and certainly Ecomundo's been a large partner in that as well, is thinking about, you know, men's engagement, and really we've talked about it in many ways around the concept of allyship, which is I think has proven its worth and seems like at least that it's going to survive this anti-DEI world that we're in, but that remains to be seen at this point as well. But I think again, programs that are and work that is designed around showing people the connection and the impact that they're having on their lives, right? They can see it and what it's doing for them, and they see the actual value of it. And I think that's been one of the challenges when I think about value. Everybody who is motivated to do this work, and even the people we're trying to include that maybe don't see the motivation to be involved, they're looking. Everybody has a sense of, you know, what's in it for me, right? Where's the impact for me on this as well? And I think that we lose that often, especially as we think about people that maybe are along the lines of more majority identities, that yeah, there's actually, it's not just doing it for a particular group of people, but there's actually something in it for you as well. And also, I think in many ways, back to Rodrigo's point about, and SK's point too, right? How do we tie this into a broader understanding of how it contributes to the broader system, right, of care and different spaces of people that need this, and that we're actually making a valuable contribution in that way of being involved in doing that work. And I think that that's a place where, as I see things moving forward, is being much more thoughtful about how we're going to pull everybody into this, break down some of the barriers that we may have created in creating safe spaces. And again, safe spaces are great to have for groups of people who need them, but finding in addition to that, finding the spaces where people can work together and people can learn. And this is back to Rodrigo's comment about, I think that we need places there where people can be involved in that community building and that sharing of the hard work that we know has to be done and the hard conversations that have to be had. It can't be done in isolation. It has to be done together. And so again, not shying away from the hard work and not allowing people to really ignore their discomfort, but to actually embrace it and think about how do we work through this and become better because of it. And I think that that's where a lot of these, whatever the next wave of DEI 2.0 is going to be tied around that. And I think allyship is a nice model that it's not perfect, but it might be a place to deviate from and ways that it can be implemented or applied differently in different spaces and different organizations and communities in a way that helps us to continue to move forward and not be drowned out by the rest of the noise that's going on.
Thanks, David. Yeah, totally makes sense. And definitely appreciate the comments about, what are the safe spaces that do exist that actually bring more people into the fold to realize they're welcome there as well. So yeah, just turning to Rodrigo before we move to the Q&A, any specific actions or organizations to get involved with for individuals on this call today to be able to respond to some of these like desperate times that we're in right now, specifically for low-income Latino immigrants in this country?
Yeah, thank you for that prompt. And I do think it's the time we're living at. It is definitely, I think, with like the amplification of media, the amplification of all these interconnected networks that we have now, are really highlighting the precarity of immigrant communities. But it's also important to tell that this story is not new. The conflation of conflating immigration status, which is merely an administrative procedure. It's literally paperwork done by government agencies with criminality, has been pursued ages and ages ago. And it's very much part of the history of this country that has been grounded in from white supremacy, xenophobia, and systemic racism from its outset. So it's not new. And it's also important to note that like that conflation between criminality and immigration has also been a bipartisan effort. And I think it's important to tell right now that it's definitely, for example, during the Clinton administration, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act was the one that tied having an unrecognized status as a criminal liability, and sharing that information with law enforcement was expanded through the Obama president, who was also known as the deporter in chief. So while I'm saying that the current administration is definitely ramped up, played on those anxieties that we talked about, this is not new, and it's something that the community has been living in for a lot of years. To answer your specific question, what organizations and what resources can the community? I think there's tons of know your rights resources. There's a lot of community defense networks going around in your. I don't know where all the panelists are coming from, but I'm sure it's not located nearly in the DMV, right? But yeah, I think knowing your rights, those rapid defense and community systems that are going around in your community, you should tap in. I do think that there are some notions that we should also adhere to. For example, the affirming that community should not be denied care, for example, right now is one of them, that the access to care should be fundamental to all. And as I said before, regardless of immigration status, it is because you're a human and you deserve access to care. And I think align yourself with organizations that are pursuing those agendas might be good. Yeah, I don't know where all the panelists are from, so I would hesitate to provide specific resources. But yeah, the Know Your Rights information that's going out, we still live with constitutional principles, and those constitutional principles apply to all who are in this country, and we should, until they are in effect. And I think transmitting that Know Your Rights information, and even affirm that notion of the importance of knowing your rights as a citizen, not because an administrative paper grants you or not grants you citizenship status, is because that notion of citizenry should be expanded. And the more informed we are, the more of a functioning democratic place we are. So I hope I answered your question by not answering it, but I do think that there are, yeah, I do think there are some resources out there, and I think also going back to the universality notion, like access to care, access to healthcare should be granted based on the universal notion that you're a human and you deserve access to care, not merely because immigrant, non-immigrant. It's our shared humanity, and I think that is, yeah. Thank you.
Really helpful, Rodrigo. Thank you. I think all of us are kind of in the DMV area, actually, all the panelists. So
the majority of the panelists, the majority of the audience is DMV?
I'm not sure about the majority of the audience.
Oh, yeah.
The panelists at
Yeah. But
yeah, no.
The audience.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for those reflections. And if I think some resources have been posted in the chat for folks who are curious, and if anyone has any other resources they'd like to share, please do share the link. But yeah, just to close out this last round of questions, Sarah Kate, I think my impression from looking at the folks who are on this call, everyone here probably isn't themselves they might be a content creator. I don't know, a YouTuber, a streamer, an Instagrammer, a TikToker, etc. A lot of us come from the NGO space, or maybe public sector government space, who are here today. What do folks here need to know about what it takes to be a digital organizer, and rethinking the way that we did door knocking and moving it to the current moment that we're in now in terms of building broad political coalitions and being inclusive of folks? How does it, what are some of the takeaways you'd love for this sort of sector of the world to know about the work that you do, and how we might be expanding our idea of who we're working with and who we're including in certain conversations?
Sure. So like I said earlier, I never intended to become a content creator. This was something that kind of came to me as I began to share, and people wanted to hear what I had to say. And so I think an important point to start with is that this is unpaid work. This is not something that I'm doing for benefit or for salary. I'm doing this for community, and we need people on the ground doing community work for community's sake. The things that sustain content creators are things like brand deals, which is organizations, companies, etc., hiring us to do advertising that is in alignment with our morals, our values, our goals with community organizing. So I've done some work like that, but since the election, a lot of that work has halted, and I've gotten very direct responses that with DEI programs being cut, the funding isn't there to hire a DEI hire, which is a non-binary person, and I'm put into a niche of I'm not sharing marketable widespread information. I'm doing something very niche. Therefore, I no longer get paid in other ways to keep informing the work that I'm doing, which is not beyond just me. This is a lot of the creators that are in my circles who are doing the work that I'm doing are experiencing very similar things, which is a trickle down effect. So our community is the community of queer organizers and allyship organizers, content creators right now are very much doing this to survive. This is survival. I do a lot of mutual aid, direct hand-in-hand donation, crowdfunding organizations as, say, insurance cuts funding for gender affirming care. I will use my platform of 150,000 people to pay for someone's surgery because they need it, to pay for their hormones because they need them. So my work is just community care, which comes back to what we're all discussing. But I'm not paid or positioned to do that for any organization or person. And I rely on larger organizations, philanthropists, people who are willing to put kind of their money and their resources where their mouth are to support people like me doing the on the ground work. So yeah, I think that we're kind of not seen. We move in silence a little bit because that's the name of the game, but we're doing what we can to support each other, and there are a lot of us out there doing this. So it's this kind of like underground world that you can find if you're looking for it, but people are really out there helping each other, which is a beautiful thing. And with the support of organizations who maybe hear this conversation or see this kind of work online and have a spark or an idea, my organization could offer this, which may be able to be passed to a creator who does this. Those connections are welcomed by content creators at this time, because at the end of the day, I'm a person who's experiencing this administration and is feeling the full range of emotions of fear and nervousness and hope and not knowing what's next and wanting to be prepared and informed without over consuming. But people are looking at me on my platform to have the answers, forgetting that I'm also that human. So with the help of bigger organizations, with government, with legislators, with whoever is able to offer assistance to people like me who kind of act as like a middle person to then hand it on to community in need is welcomed and accepted.
Really, really powerful comments, Sarah Kate. And I know like many of the organizations and folks who have been in this space for a long time are typically led by folks in an older generation who might not necessarily understand the depth and richness of community organizing that's happening with younger generations, and seeing the power of what people like you are doing in these digital spaces where people are finding connection and hope. So thanks for the work that you do, and we're hoping to continue to spread that message beyond, just this webinar today. So with that, I'll turn to some audience questions here. We have a few in the chat and in the Q&A, so I'll kind of toggle between the two. But the first in the Q&A section are any key champions that we should be aware of on the Hill that we can be reaching out to share impacts. I'm not sure if any of you have had communication or collaboration with folks on the Hill. But yeah, anyone want to take that away?
I guess I can speak to one piece of that, and it's the only collaboration that I've had, and certainly Ekimundo and Gary, you've been involved in this too. But we, Representative Gomez, Jimmy Gomez, out of California, who leads the Dads Caucus and coordinates very closely with on the Mamas Caucus as well, and is doing a lot of great work in building community with in Congress, to pass a lot of different legislation that affects a broad range of issues, everything from childcare to parental leave to minimum wage. There's a whole slew of things that, again, through his own lived experience. I mean, if you've ever heard the congressman talk about his own personal experience in growing up in an immigrant family in California, that it's really powerful. And for him to really try to translate that in so many different ways. He did it in the state of California before he came to Congress, and he's doing it now in Congress. And the challenge, of course, is this is a bipartisan issue. Care is a bipartisan issue, and this is fundamentally what these are all about, is providing better resources and support and an infrastructure around care in this country. The irony, I think, behind a lot of it is that, over 80% of Americans, support legislation related to this, and yet it still tends to be a very bipartisan, very one-sided issue when it comes to Congress and our government. But anyway, he's one. He has a great coalition. I would certainly recommend everybody take a look at who's involved in that, because it is a widespread caucus today and representing probably most of the states that you are living in and working in today. And you can probably find somebody there who is working on these issues that you can reach out to.
Thanks, David. Oh, go ahead, Sarah. Kate.
Yeah, I have just one name. If anybody's looking for trans representation, Sarah McBride from Delaware is the first openly transgender member of Congress and is currently there.
Yeah, I was just going to add that it being in the healthcare space and more at the local level, I do think that there's also value in pursuing county and state representatives, not just looking at what's going on at the Hill. Healthcare ultimately is a state and more local issue, and I think finding out representatives in your state and county area is also very, very important, not just to look at what's going on at the federal level, but also consider, for example, right now, the state of Maryland is pursuing protections around sensitive locations as for the Office of the Attorney General to provide guidelines on where immigration and customs enforcement can enter. So protecting schools, healthcare centers. So I think also just plugging the importance of state and county representatives.
Yeah, and along with that, I would also, on the local level, for the state of Maryland anyway, Healthcare Facilities Association of Maryland, who's led by Joe DeMattos, works very closely with the state government and all the healthcare at every level across the state of Maryland, and again, increasing capacity and access, I think, is one of their key things that they focus on, as well as the ability, right, to provide remuneration, right, the pay aspect as well for our workers.
Amazing. And yeah, beyond the Hill, I would just really encourage folks to reach out to their local government officials. Especially, we're seeing a ton of amazing activity and action at the municipal level. We're doing some work with a group called Metropolis to try and get cities to come together and build collective power with care policies in their own individual cities. So looking at the next 4 years of this administration, so much can still happen at the sub-federal level. And so I know that New York City is having a fatherhood and care conference coming up in the coming weeks. So New York City is doing some really cool work around engaging men on care policies. And so lots of folks to connect with at the city level as well as beyond. So thanks for that question. Seeing some awesome resources being posted in the chat. Thank you so much to everyone who's been doing that. Going to another question. I'm seeing Dominic asking Sarah specifically about how your posts and accounts are being suppressed. Not many people know kind of the the tech and the systems behind that process and what it actually looks like and feels like in real time. So if you could speak to your experience about that, we'd love to learn more.
Sure. So, as I said, there's layers to this, right? So the funding that content creators receive in order to do the free labor that they do comes from outside resources, paying for advertising, paying for brand deals. Those things have significantly been cut for me due to DEI. Cuts, as well as companies just not wanting to align themselves either way, saying that my existence is political and therefore they no longer want to work with me and make that stance. And then outside of that, my actual personal account posts will be lower in engagement and lower in reach when I look at my analytics and my insights if I use certain hashtags. So words like transgender, non-binary, DEI, inclusion, social justice, those posts are quite literally being seen by less people if you are very outwardly trying to reach those people. If you leave things like hashtags and certain words in your post and your caption off, you'll likely have a farther reach, but then there's also more of a chance that you'll receive kind of like the groups that you didn't want to see those posts, which will lead to an incline in hate, the post being reported, which could end up with the post being deleted. Also, when you're at a certain scale on social media, the things that you share allow you to make money per view. So if you're getting things deleted, you're not making money. So it's just this kind of cycle of trying to be smart enough not to use the words that will trigger the suppression, but also trying to reach the people that need to see these things the most. And all of that being said, there are also accounts that are simply being deleted. My partner's account was deleted for discussing holistic approaches to gender affirming care. Without warning and without the ability to retrieve that account back, and she ran her business through her account. So that's just one example of kind of the larger scope of silencing and attempts to keep this work quiet, because the administration is setting up kind of a system so that people in the trans and queer community aren't able to access what they need for care and for mental health sources. So the people who are doing the work to kind of get around those orders are also being silenced and suppressed.
That's super thorough. Thank you for those reflections. And yeah, I like Dominic's comment in the chat. The irony of this being a freedom of speech administration is quite stark. Going to the Q&A, Lakshman asks, given the administration's rollback of DEI policies under the guise of restoring merit-based systems, how can advocates for gender, sexual rights, and racial justice counter the narrative that DEI initiatives are a form of reverse discrimination? So what are the strategies to communicate that? Yeah, would love folks' reflections on some of those issues. Maybe David, if I could volunteer you to go first.
Yeah, I just saw it pop up too. I was reading it. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, just doing a quick read there, and certainly, you know, the merit-based argument has, like with lots of different arguments, has been, you know, it's an old one that's been around for a long time. Just like we've heard other aspects of that keeps getting, you know, dredged back up here. It's no different than, for example, you know, I come from also a military background and work with do a lot of work with the military as well. And it's the same thing with, again, trying the conversations around, you know, and we see all the recent firings of women and people of color at the senior ranks, and that's also going even deeper these days. That, you know, they're dredging up all these old arguments again about how the classics around that have been, that again, there's a merit-based piece to it, a competence-based piece to it that's part of the argument, but also that it somehow ruins morale or readiness. which is performance. In the military, that's performance. And those arguments have been around since every time we've tried to integrate and be more inclusive in the military, whether it was from a race perspective, it was a gender perspective, it was a sexuality perspective. Every single one of those integrations has used those same arguments. And so we find ourselves right back in the same situation again, and having to, again, and it keeps us all busy, I think, which is, I think, the goal of all this is to force us to go back and to have to make all of those arguments again, and continue to reinforce the reality of what they're saying, and the lack of evidence and falsehoods that are connected to it. But that doesn't make it any less important that we still have to do it. And I think that's the challenge, that many of us who have been doing this work for a long time, I feel like I'm going backwards to have to go back and make these arguments again. But the good news is that the evidence is there. The arguments have been well researched, and it doesn't take much to figure it out. It's really interesting, though, that I feel like they're just trying to keep us busy and not doing the work that we want to be doing and need to be doing, which I think is frustrating for many of us. And so I think a lot of this is kind of picking and choosing battles in terms of where is this actually going to become some rallying cry for the right, in some way that we're going to have to stand up to it, and where is it? It's just more noise, right? They're just flooding the airwaves with this noise that we continue to have to either ignore or address. And I think that's the challenge, is we have to make some key decisions there around what really needs to be addressed in that case. But I'm not sure if I completely answered your question there, but there was a lot in there. It was a great question.
Yeah, and I love the point about, like, this research and these impacts have already been demonstrated in positive ways. How can we then translate those findings to larger audiences who need to know about that, in ways that they might not read empirical study on an online journal, but how can we translate that evidence into accessible ways that are attractive for a wider audience? To Sarah Kate's points about partnering with folks who know how to disseminate that information to their own unique audiences, I think is a really cool way of thinking about that next step in the process there. And just to turn to Rodrigo, to Laxman's point in the Q&A, this whole, like, narrative around merit-based work that people should be able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and everything that they deserve is sort of like a dominant cultural narrative that has existed at least in the US since time immemorial. So how do you think about, specifically in working with immigrant populations, around this idea that you work for what you get, and the idea of merit-based society? How do you think about that sort of narrative in your work, and countering the dominant narrative that we have in the US?
Yeah, I think that's been thoroughly disproven. And I think that narrative of get yourself up the bootstrap as well is like to invisibilize. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. Invisibilize, that's correct, yeah. The domestic care work that for life history through humanity has been performantly done at the home, and only at the advent of industrial capitalism that was gendered, right? And it became largely woman-led thing to do. And I think that way of invisibilizing that hard work, that day-to-day work, that consistency of work, and not considering that as work, but as just providing care, I think that and the added need of exploitable cheap labor thoroughly disprove that it's hard work, clocked hours, that will actually be the thing as a merit-based system that we call it. Like, we know we've all seen that equity graphic, right, of your starting point. I think that's I don't know if you're referring to the kid in the little box, and like we don't start at the same place. And I think um, the systemic or the systems that have led certain populations to be at an advantage over others come at the expense of others. So I think maybe that merit-based myth applies if you exclude and invisibilize others. Just going back to what Sarah Kate was saying, and going back to sort of that intangible care work that happens as well, because that intangible care work ultimately is what allows society to function. So I don't know if I'm answering the question, but I don't think there is a merit-based. I think the merit-based is also part of the myth, is going back in line with everything that this administration is doing, of like it's like the Make America Great Again continuation. It's a bit of magical thinking and mysticism that is needed for that movement to have an enemy, and that narrative falls in line. I think from an immigrant perspective, and from that is thoroughly debunked. However, that narrative is so ingrained that even among a lot of immigrant communities, that notion of the American dream, that notion that anyone can make it, I think there is some value in what this country provides in sense of that it might be easier to open up your own businesses, but like that notion of consistent entrepreneurship, and that it's up to the individual to pull yourself up the bootstrap is factually incorrect. And you need a society, you need social systems, you need these safety nets for everyone to succeed. I think the merit, the pull yourself out of your bootstrap, may apply to some, but not out of all. And those who benefit from that merit-based benefit from the invisible care, from the invisible systems that allow them to get ahead. And I think that is a powerful narrative that even a lot of that is easy to buy into, because it conveniently eliminates everything that goes on in the background, and specifically the care work that allows it to sustain itself. So I hope I answered that question. It wasn't too convoluted, but yeah.
No, thank you so much, Rodrigo. I love the point about how we invisibilize care, and I think that's the best verb that I can come up with too as well. So I think it's such an important point about which type of work is seen and valued. So yeah, I'm just gonna go to one more question and then hand it over to Gary Barker for some closing remarks. And there's one question in the Q&A. One of the participants is abroad and is just wondering what progressive academic entities or otherwise think tanks, cultural centers are actually convening spaces to facilitate dialogue and conversation about some of these topics that we're all talking about. I can speak kind of from Ecumunda's end to kick us off before turning to you all. We've been thinking a lot about moving to spaces that we don't normally go to. Oftentimes we go to big convenings about gender equality and progressive topics and issues, but we've been thinking more about different cultural communities like game developer conferences or trust and safety team conferences in the tech world, to be bringing some of our research and our insights into new spaces that we typically haven't gone to before, but we think could be really fruitful for dialogue and exchange with some of the folks who are in that space. So just that's from our end what we've been thinking a lot about, but I'd love to turn it over to any panelists who have any ideas about where some of these conversations are taking place and where we might need to be actively stepping into. I know Sarah Kate mentioned a lot of online communities and digital creators to follow, but if anyone has any closing thoughts around where we should be looking as next steps.
I can speak from the perspective of of La Clínica. La Clínica, we've had an initiative called Diálogos para la Acción, Dialogues for Action. And because when we talk about immigration, it has to be across borders, right? Like, and we've held a number of conversations with partners in El Salvador, Honduras, around key topics of migration push factors and how that is affecting the health of the community that we receive here in the DMV, right? So we host those twice a year. I can share, and it's always through the lens of that international dialogue that needs to happen. So I think just to answer that, yes, I think universities, larger organizations, and national organizations have their own. But I think from a community-based perspective and a community dealing with immigration and health, I think we foster that communication across borders as well with partners in Central America. So.
Thanks, Shirley, for putting that link in the chat for folks who are around for the 6th of March. Feel free to register. David, any other thoughts there?
Yeah, I was just going to point out, yeah, Shirley, our colleagues over at GW doing work like she's putting the link there. So I think the higher ed institutions, it probably varies a little bit, but I think those of us who have initiatives and work that are going on related to gender, for example, I find in our community that most of us are doubling down now and trying to expand the conversation out into different communities, different spaces, staying visible. I think that's one of those things that people, if they don't see something, in this, again, in the void, what's really going on there. And so trying to remain visible and doing some of that, I think, is really important. And we're going to be doing a convening in DC in May as well, focused on how do we bring more people into this conversation from an allyship perspective that really gets to more of a more broader national conversation that I think is important, and especially in this time. We couldn't have predicted how the relevance of it when we were first planning this, but it has just become even more important based on recent events in the US. So yeah, thanks for the question.
And if Sarah Kate, if you have any other closing thoughts, let me know. But if not, I will turn it over to Gary Barker, President and CEO of Equimundo, for some closing thoughts. And just before I go, I want to say a massive thanks to all of our panelists for spending their time with us today. So just huge hand clap to everyone involved and for everyone coming. And without further ado, Gary, take it away.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Caroline, for facilitating, and thanks, David and Rodrigo and Sarah Kate, for joining us. Inspired by this, it's so, I think we're part of what we're trying to do in this moment is just hold community. It is so easy to despair, and so I think just to stay and step into a calm moment of we're not going away, and these causes aren't going away. One of the things that we're trying to do at Equimundo is first do some listening, particularly to young men who are the least likely to vote in progressive directions. And together with several colleagues, including Caroline, we're getting ready for another State of American Men study. And as part of that, last week, a few of us were doing a round of focus groups and interviews with young men in the geographic center of the country in Kansas City. And, it's telling and quite concerning. On the concerning part, the white young men we talked to, virtually all of them Trump voters, are worried about being canceled. They're worried about staying middle class, and they're worried about finding love. A huge kind of dating recession going on. So those were their concerns. 20 minutes away, young Black and brown men were worried about their literal safety. Young African American men worried about literally staying alive. They're all worried about finding love and keeping the love they already have. A trans young man who we talked to is worried about, Sarah Kate, what you talked about, of being erased, of feeling like he spent years of a journey to have the body and to be in the world the way that he wanted to be, and now feeling like, where will that go? The bottom line is that none of them felt particularly this country has offered them a place to be seen and affirmed. The progressive policies that we've been pushing felt like they haven't really affected me. The middle-class young men, we needed to hold them a bit accountable for that of, actually they're working quite well for them, but they didn't particularly feel that. And the other energy that spins in there, and that's what we saw in this election, is an energy around tear it all down. And the all means the DEI policies that we care so much about, a functioning government, a democracy. So I think we came back just very concerned about, how do we step into that moment and hold, a dialogue with colleagues. Now that these things weren't shared in anger. So the good thing was we could hold a dialogue. If there was if there was a bright spot in the week, and to Caroline's point about, are we willing to go have different conversations in different spaces? Also, together with colleagues, sat in on a 3F group, if any of you know about this, the faith, fellowship, and fitness groups that are now about 75,000 men around the US. The group we sat in on was majority Trump voters. They know where we stood. They were not angry about a conversation with us. They were quite welcoming to be in the space. And most of the conversation they're worried about is kind of economics. Will their houses hold value? Will we go into a slump? And if we had a dialogue about equity that was reasonably open, they were always ready to talk to us. So I offer those as examples around, where do we need to go next? And I guess the other piece that I'd lean into and is thinking about like slowly and thoughtfully regaining the equity word. I appreciate Aubrey put a link there about, new language. And I think we do get really stuck in our progressive speak. Across the course of last week, if we had conversations that are about what we mean by equity is, it's not okay that Black and brown people die on average 5 years earlier than white people in the US. For us, equity means, what does equity mean for trans folks? It's not okay that LGBT plus individuals, young people, are 4 times likely to take their own lives than their straight peers. That it's not okay that, the city I live in, white households own 81 times on average the amount of income as a Black household. Let's tell that to the new Republicans coming into town. That amount of inequality is not okay. The one that their eyes kind of lit up a little bit is to say, is it okay that 1% of the wealthiest people in this country own 30% of the wealth? And they're trying to sell you a pathway to that you'll never achieve. That was the one that got a few guys kind of looking at it. So I offer that, just to say, how can we step quietly into, let's say what equity means. Let's step away from our language and see if we can have these kinds of dialogues. I'm also somewhat encouraged by, and I'm glad that we posted on there, of reaching out to members of Congress. And David mentioned the Dad's Caucus, 30 members who all got reelected, a few of them in highly disputed districts, and they talked to men voters as fathers and caregivers. And so, Rodrigo, to your point, that how do we get this dialogue shifted, that care gets valued, and particularly, and I appreciated, you're acknowledging how much the 12 to 14 million undocumented individuals here are the ones feeding us and caring for us and our households. How to step into that and get men to care about that topic as well, I think is so key. So I'm gonna try to end on that so that we can stay positive on that. But we really appreciate staying in dialogue on these conversations, and it is, we think it's important that each of our acts of resistance and pushing back and finding these alternative spaces, so that we don't, and Sarah, Kate, your comments around how easily they can erase us in some spaces. and particularly, LGBT plus individuals. We cannot be erased. We've got to step in dialogue and acknowledge we don't have to convince the most rabid right-wing voices. We've got to convince a few percent in the middle that our arguments about equity are not only true and right, they're the only way ahead. Yeah. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll keep the dialogue going. Open to more conversations. Thank you for sharing all the links in there. Thanks again to Caroline and all the rest of the Equimundo team for organizing. Hope to see you all again soon, and thanks for the struggles and the battles and the causes that you all represent. Rodrigo, David, Sarah, Kate, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Ciao.
Thank you.
Thanks.